The vet stood frozen, his gaze riveted to the frail body, sprawled lifeless on the examination table. It was so quiet in the room, there was only the beep, beep, beep from the heart monitor. She had been brought in almost completely dead, weak, trembling, with shallow, uneven breaths. All signs pointed to one grim reality. It was too late. Story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. "We've done everything we can," he whispered, his tone heavy with defeat. He looked to the assistant next to him, who nodded silently, her eyes sympathetic. The vet bent down, running a hand lightly over the dog's chest. It was cold. Her heartbeat was undetectable. "Come on, girl," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, just let me try again." Minutes passed like hours. The vet's mind ran, reviewing every action they had taken. Had they missed something? Could they have done more? Yet no matter how much he tried to shake the doubt off, it hung on him like a shadow. "We should call it," the assistant said in a low voice, shaking. The vet gritted his teeth, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. He despised this part of the job. It never got easier. But before he even had a chance to speak, something happened that electrified the room. The dog twitched, not a random spasm, a deliberate movement. A paw stretched, a head turned, and eyes opened to meet the vet's, with an intensity that made him forget to breathe. Her gaze was lucid, piercing, and suffused with something that the vet hadn't expected to find either. Resolution. "Wait, did you see that?" the vet said with a gasp. The assistant gasped. "She's moving!" The vet moved in closer, his pulse quickening. The chest of the dog began to rise and fall in a controlled manner, with her breaths becoming deeper and stronger with the passing seconds. As if she had made a decision. She wasn't ready to go yet. "You're not throwing in the towel, are you?" the vet said, a smile breaking across his face. "Well, neither are we." Revitalized, the team sprang back into action. They made changes to her IV, tightened up her oxygen, monitored her vitals carefully. What had been a room of quiet despair was now abuzz with hope. And in that moment, the vet knew one thing for certain. This dog was not only a survivor. She was a fighter. This was just an introduction to an incredible adventure that would test them and transform them forever. The ambience in the room changed. Hope ignited, where there had been nothing but defeat just moments earlier. The vet gripped the side of the table and took a few steps closer, watching the dog's every move with new interest, his heart racing. "Deep breaths. There you go, girl," he said, his tone cautious but hopeful. "Keep fighting." While the dog's breathing had been shallow and labored, it was becoming steadier. Her eyes opened for a moment, with the vet's gaze meeting hers before she closed them again, as if to say, "I'm not finished yet." But her body remained critically weak, and the vet knew this fight was not yet behind them. He looked at the heart monitor. Her pulse was weak, but it was there. "We're not losing her today," the vet said, turning to his assistant with a sense of urgency. "We'll stabilize her first. Administer another bolus of fluids and keep a close eye on her oxygen saturation." The assistant nodded and ran off to do as he was instructed. At the same time, the vet's hand rested gently on the dog's side, palpating the shallow rise and fall of her ribs. Each breath was a minor victory. Hours and minutes seemed to fade away as the team did everything it could to save the dog. Hours went by, with each whisper bringing tension and comfort. And then, right when the sun started to set outside, the vet saw something unusual. The dog stirred, raising her head slightly. This time her eyes opened fully, clearer, stronger than before. The vet smiled and crouched next to her. "Hey there, girl. You're tougher than you look, aren't you?" But there was something in her eyes that made him hesitate, an urgency, as if she were trying to tell him something. "What is it?" the vet said gently, leaning in. "What are you trying to say?" The dog was dragging herself across the ground, shivering. She slowly, agonizingly tried to push herself up, eyes flicking to the door. The vet frowned. "She wants to go somewhere," he thought. The assistant, observing from across the room, moved in. "Do you think she's trying to guide us somewhere?" The vet paused briefly, then nodded. "It's possible. Animals sometimes have a way of revealing things we can't see ourselves." He kindly cradled the dog in his arms, her body still weak, but her eyes alert. They stepped outside, the coolness of evening wrapping around them. The dog sat up, raising her nose and sniffing as she smelled the air. She appeared to recognize her surroundings as she looked down the far end of the street. "She's been here before," the vet thought to himself, his interest growing. He turned to look where she was looking, his heart pounding. "Where are you taking me, girl?" The dog gave a little whimper, her eyes pleading. Every second that passed, the vet could feel her urgency swell. "Okay," he said, changing his hand position. "Let's see where this leads." As they walked up the street, the vet felt more and more that this dog somehow had a story much richer than he had envisioned. Each step inspired another round of questions. Where had she come from? How had she gotten to be in such horrible shape? And what had she been so desperately trying to show him? They turned a corner, the quiet street drenched with an amber glow from the setting sun. The dog whined again, her gaze steady at a ramshackle house at the end of the block. The vet froze. There was something about the house that sent a chill down his spine. Is this where it all began? He wondered. The dog's breath became quicker and her body more charged with emotion. The vet knew he had to trust her instincts. He inhaled deeply as his pulse quickened. Whatever was on the other side of that door, he was about to discover. But what he found inside would leave him absolutely speechless and alter everything he thought he knew about this dog's incredible adventure. The house sat at the end of the street, its windows dark, its body lifeless. The door was slightly ajar. A cracked paint exterior and overgrown weeds gave it an abandoned look. The vet's instincts told him to be cautious, but the dog's urgency drove him on. Her body was mostly relaxed in his embrace, though her eyes were greedy on the house as she let out a soft whine. "Good girl," he whispered. "Let's see what's inside." He walked slowly toward the house, the evening shadows stretching across the cracked pavement. His heart raced at every pace, the silence around him deafening. He opened the front door slowly. It creaked. A musty smell of mildew and dust hung in the air, intermingling with something else, something faint yet deeply unsettling. The vet paused for a moment, repositioning his grip on the dog. "You've been here before, right?" he said, speaking in a whisper. The dog raised her head, her nose quivering in the air. Then, without explanation, she began squirming out of his embrace, her gaze fixed on a door at the far end of the hall. "What is it?" the vet said, placing her down gently. The dog lumbered to the door, her gait slow but purposeful. It felt like she had purpose behind every move, like she knew exactly what she was doing. The vet trailed behind, his curiosity now intertwined with a sense of escalating dread. The door at the end of the hallway was cracked open, exposing a dark basement staircase. The dog paused as it reached the top, turning back to the vet with bright eyes. "You're trying to get me to go down there?" he asked, swallowing hard. The dog gave a low bark, keeping her eyes on him. Holding his breath, the vet switched on his phone's flashlight and climbed carefully down the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, shafts of light forming long shadows on the concrete walls. The beam of light darted across the basement at the bottom of the stairs, a chilly, barren vacuum filled with dust and the decaying fingerprints of time. It was cluttered with old furniture, splintered crates, and piles of newspapers. But suddenly, he noticed something. In the furthest corner, half concealed beneath a pile of rags, there was a small cage. The metal bars were rusted and bent, but there was no mistaking it. A breeding cage. The vet choked on his own breath. Oh no. The dog stepped gingerly toward the cage and sniffed the screen before sinking to the ground beside it. Her gaze swung to the vet, full of an emotion he couldn't put a name to. Pain, sadness, and something deeper. "Is this where they held you?" he gasped, his voice trembling. The dog lowered her head and trembled slightly. The vet knelt beside her and placed a hand on her back. "You were trapped here," he said, his heart ripping apart as pieces of her story started to fall into place. "This is ground zero for it all." He surveyed the basement, his brain kicking into overdrive. And this wasn't a neglected home. It had long been associated with something more sinister. The cage, the tattered collars on the floor. It all said the same thing, a breeding operation. The vet tightened his fists, anger coursing through him. The idea of what this dog had been subjected to, what untold others might have been subjected to here, made his blood boil. "Not anymore," he said. His tone wasn't of resolve. "You're no longer a hostage. You're free." The dog stared at him, and her eyes glimmered with trust and gratitude. But as relief then washed over him, another question gnawed at the back of his mind. If this house had been a breeding operation, who had left it behind? And more importantly, why? The vet knew they wouldn't be able to stay there for long. Whoever had run this place before might still be out there. He scooped the dog into his arms, holding it more tightly, protectively. "We're leaving," he said. "You and no one is ever going to make you hurt again." The vet's determination strengthened as they climbed back up the stairs. This was about more than saving one dog anymore. It was about finding out the truth and ensuring that no animal would have to go through this again. And down to his bones, he understood this dog was more than a survivor. She was a piece of a puzzle that was larger than either one had ever imagined. The vet scooped the dog up and walked back to his car, his thoughts racing as the house faded from view. The gravity of what they had just learned loomed over them. "How long were you there?" he said, looking at the dog. Her eyes, weary yet peaceful, seemed to contain answers he couldn't yet comprehend. The vet's mind had already represented the basement in every detail as they drove back to the clinic. The rusted cage, the grime-encrusted collars, the deathly quiet. It wasn't simply an abandoned house. It was a neglected staging of anguish. And the dog. She was the only survivor. At the clinic again, the assistant looked up from her desk, concern lighting her eyes. "Where did you go?" "They all were," she said, moving closer to him. The veterinarian gently laid the dog on the examination table and sighed. "We returned to where it began," he said. "And you're not going to believe what we discovered." His voice steady, but filled with quiet fury, he described the house in detail. The assistant covered her mouth and her eyes widened as she listened. "A breeding operation," she said, her voice just above a whisper. I thought they put those places out of business around here." The vet shook his head. Clearly, not all of them. Some left her behind, assuming she wouldn't make it. But she did. She fought her way out, and somehow she reached us. The assistant looked at the dog with both admiration and sadness. "She's a miracle," she said quietly. The vet nodded, stroking the dog's head with his hand. "She is. But this isn't over. We need to identify who did this, and ensure they're brought to an end for good." The dog exhaled softly, resting its head on the table. For the first time, she seemed genuinely at ease. In that one instant, the vet could sense everything her journey had carried, all she had weathered, all she had navigated. "You're safe now," he said in a soothing voice. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Yet even as those words rolled off his tongue, a knot twisted in his stomach. If someone had abandoned her, that person was likely still out there and wouldn't want anyone exposing their secrets. The following days were a blur of recovery and investigation. The vet alerted the authorities about the house being abandoned, and they said they would investigate. The dog, on the other hand, kept getting bigger. Her gaze, long flat and vacant, glimmered with quiet power. Every step she took was a triumph. Every wag of her tail was a testament that she had beaten the odds. While the vet was checking her vitals one afternoon, the dog did the one thing that made him stop in his tracks. She rose all the way up, no tremble, and moved to him, her tail wagging slow but steady. "Well, would you look at that?" the vet said, smiling. "You've still got some fight left in you, then." The dog gave a soft bark, almost as if she was agreeing. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. After all she had been through, she wasn't merely surviving, she was thriving. But the veterinarian knew better than to relax. He had learned one thing during these many years. Miracles seldom come for free, and the hardest test was yet to come. The next few days were filled with cautious optimism and zealous focus. The dog slowly recovered, regaining her strength hour by hour. The vet observed in wonder as she made small but confident rounds at the clinic, her tail wagging softly, a show of trust and gratitude that previously had been absent. But something still felt off. He couldn't shake the memory of the abandoned house. It stalked his thoughts. Who had left her there? How come they were gone in the blink of an eye, leaving cages and traces of something much more ominous? One afternoon, while sitting at his desk, the vet took a closer look. Then he took out his laptop and searched regional news reports for references to illegal breeding facilities. It didn't take long to find something that was disturbing. It had only been 2 weeks since a raid had taken place at a suspected breeder's property near the clinic. Many dogs had been saved, but the report said a handful fled before authorities arrived. The vet's heart raced as he read the description of the dogs, medium-sized mixed-breed golden coat. "It's her," he said, leaning back in his chair. His eyes swept the rest of the article. It was the home of a man who had been wanted for years, a man whose methods were as ruthless as they were effective, who would do whatever he could to stay out of the hands of the authorities. "This is not the end," the vet said, dread washing over him. He looked over at the dog who lay curled up on her bed, blissfully ignorant of the chaos unfolding around her. The front door chimed, shattering the tense silence. The veterinarian looked up, expecting a client. Instead, a tall man in a dark jacket leaned just inside the door, his eyes scanning the room. "Can I help you?" the vet said, keeping his voice steady but wary. The man's gaze fixated on the dog. The vet's spine chilled at something in the man's presence. His expression didn't change. "That's a nice dog," the man said, in a tone that was casual but still unsettling. "Where'd you find her?" The vet stepped a foot in front of the dog, his protective instincts responding. "She came in as a stray," he said. "Why do you ask?" The man shrugged. "Just curious. She looks familiar." The air thickened, the space between them charged. The vet's mind raced. There was no question now. This man hadn't come by chance. "I have another appointment, if you'll excuse me," the vet said, his words polite but firm. The man stood for a moment, narrowing his eyes. Then he turned and walked toward the egress. "Take care of that dog," he told her over his shoulder. "She's special." The door snapped shut behind him, the chime ringing in the deserted clinic. The vet blew a sigh, his heart racing. "Who was that?" the attendant asked, entering the room. The vet shook his head, gazing into the door. "I don't know, but I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of him." He turned his face back to the dog, his jaw clenching as he steeled himself. "We'll protect you," he whispered, and crouched down next to her. "I mean, no one's going to take you away. Not now, not ever." But he secretly knew the man would return. And when he came back, they would have to be ready. After the visit from the strange man, the clinic felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The vet could not shake the sense of foreboding that something was coming. He was at his desk, his fingers tapping on the table, as he glanced at the dog lying peacefully on her bed. She was unaware of the tension hanging in the air. Finally, her body felt relaxed after days of tension. But the vet knew better. "We've got to be prepared," he whispered, reopening his laptop. If the man was indeed part of the illegal breeding ring, he couldn't afford to be caught in the act. He began by outlining the house's location and its connection to the recent raid. The more he dug, the more disturbing the picture grew. There had been numerous complaints over the years, anonymous tips about dogs kept in terrible conditions, but nothing had ever been substantiated. And now, the gentleman from earlier. It's not a coincidence, the vet rationalized. He was looking for her. At that moment, the front door chimed again. The vet's heart leapt, his eyes flying to the entrance. But this time, it was the assistant, clutching a pile of medical records. "Are you okay?" she said, noticing his tense shoulders. The vet nodded, albeit slowly, his mind still far from settled. "You know we need to be extra careful," he said, looking at the dog. "Someone's watching her." The assistant's eyes widened. "You think it's related to that breeding operation?" "I'm almost positive," the vet said. "And if they have her back, they're not going to stop until they get what they demand." The assistant swallowed hard. "What do we do?" "We help keep her safe," the vet said sternly, "and we make sure they have no reason to return." Over the next several days, the vet exercised every precaution that occurred to him. He put a security camera in the clinic's entrance, changed the locks, and never took his eyes off the dog. But all those measures didn't eliminate the feeling of being watched. That's when the vet did something strange. One night, just before the clinic closed, a car was idling across the street. The windows were tinted so no one could see inside. The vet's pulse quickened. He observed for several minutes, looking for the car to move, but it did not budge. "They're watching," he thought, balling his hands into fists. He walked to the door again and carefully locked it and turned off the lights. He remained by the window, peering out through the blinds. The vehicle finally pulled away, vanishing into the evening darkness. The vet let out a breath, but his nerves were still on alert. "This is not over," he said to himself. They're testing us, waiting for the right moment. He turned back to the dog who had raised her head, sensing his tension from the lifted body. Her eyes were on his, steady and calm, almost neutral, as if she were saying to him, "We'll get through this together." The veterinarian knelt beside her, stroking her. "You've been through worse, right?" he said softly. "And you survived. We'll survive this too." The dog sighed softly and rested her head on his knee. She had faith in him, and at that moment, the vet dug deep and found something. "I'm not going to stop fighting for you," he vowed. "We'll face this together." But deep down, he knew they had little time left. The person watching wasn't going to wait forever. And when they moved, the vet would have to be prepared, because this was no longer just about rescuing a dog. It was about fighting for everything she stood for. The next morning, the vet opened the clinic in advance. He hadn't slept much. All night his mind was swirling over the odd encounter with the man, and the even odder part, where the car had been parked, watching from across the street. He opened the front door and entered, the air thick with something that should not be there. He looked at the security camera monitor on his desk. Last night, the same car reappeared briefly, before once again vanishing into darkness. "They're watching her," he muttered, his pulse racing. "They're waiting for something." The dog, who had been sleeping on her bed in the corner of the clinic, jumped up when she saw him. Her eyes sparkled with trust and warmth, unaware of the danger lurking outside. The vet approached and knelt down next to her, his hand softly resting on her head. "Morning, girl," he said gently. "I hope you slept more than I did." The dog barked softly, her tail wagging lazily. That sight put a smile on the vet's face, relieving some of the heaviness in his chest. But the peace soon broke down. The doorbell rang, and the vet looked up to see a delivery driver holding a large package. "I got a delivery for you," the driver said, placing the box on the counter. The vet frowned. He hadn't placed any recent orders. He moved toward the box slowly, his heart racing. "Who sent this?" he said, looking at the delivery slip. "Sender not listed," the driver said with a shrug before walking out. The vet stared at the box for a moment and then opened it very carefully. Inside, a nondescript envelope lay on top of a pile of shredded newspaper. He tore open the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. The note inside was brief, scrawled in messy block letters. "She doesn't belong to you. Stay out of this." A shiver ran down the vet's spine. He looked at the dog, protective instincts kicking in. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said, crumpling the note in his hand. "But it's not going to work." He took out his phone and called the local police. It was time to start taking this seriously. The officer on the line promised they would dispatch someone to check out the clinic and patrol the area around it. But even with that reassurance, the vet couldn't help but feel that things were about to get serious. That afternoon, the assistant came to the clinic. Immediately, she sensed the tension in the air. "What's going on?" she said, narrowing her eyes as she spotted the crumpled note on the desk. The vet gave it to her in silence. Her face went pale as she read it. "This is serious," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "What if they come back?" "And then we'll be ready," the vet said decisively. "But they should not take her away from me. Not after all that she's been through." The assistant nodded, the fire in her eyes burning bright. "We'll protect her, whatever it takes." The dog stared at both of them, head cocked as if she were following every word. There was a strength in her gaze that hadn't been there before, a quiet resilience, the result of everything she'd been through. The vet knelt beside her again, his tone calm but laced with raw emotion. "They may think that they can frighten us away," he added, "but they don't know how strong we are. We've fought too hard to give up now." The dog nudged him with her nose, a gentle pledge to keep fighting along with him. The sun was going down, and there were long shadows around the clinic. Outside, the world felt tranquil, but once inside, they were braced for what might come next. Because the vet knew one thing: this was not over, and the storm was about to unleash. Night folded over, muffling the clinic in darkness. The vet checked the door and window latches again, his nerves tingling. The note had given him the uneasy feeling that something larger awaited. The dog lay curled and sleeping in her bed, her eyes half open, tracking the vet about the room. She appeared calm, but her ears perked at every faint sound outside, as though she could feel the tension in the air. "We'll be fine," the vet said quietly, to himself more than to her. "We've got this." But the words felt hollow. He knew deep down that they were vulnerable. As he settled into his desk, the security monitor blinked. A shadow crossed the screen, so fast, almost imperceptibly. The vet halted, narrowing his eyes. He rewound it, replayed the footage. The shadow came back, except now it stayed just outside the clinic's front door. His heart began to race. "They're here." His pulse was pounding in his ears as he rose and crossed toward the window. He peered through the blinds, surveying the street. Initially, it all felt perfectly normal. The street was still, light from the streetlights filtering long shadows across the pavement. Then he noticed it. A figure hovering just outside the circle of light, shrouded in darkness. The vet choked on his own breath. The figure didn't move, didn't say a word, just watched. "What do you want?" the vet grumbled, balling his fists at his side. The dog growled, but low, and fixed her eyes on a window. Her body stiffened, prepared for what was to come. The figure turned at last and stepped into the shadows. The vet sighed, but his relief was brief. He knew they hadn't gone for good. This was just the beginning. If there was going to be a net closing in on this case, the vet wasn't having it. He picked up his phone and called the police again. "They were here," he said frantically. "I need someone to swing by and patrol the area tonight." The officer said they'd send a unit, but the vet knew even hanging up that it might not be enough. "We cannot wait for them to act first," he imagined himself thinking as he paced the room. "We need to be one step ahead." He turned to the dog, now up on her feet, her eyes bright and alert. "You've been through worse," he told her softly, "and you survived. We'll survive this too." The dog cocked her head and slowly wagged her tail. It was a little thing, but it gave the vet the strength to perform. He spent the next several hours making preparations, reinforced the doors, checked his security cameras, and organized the clinic's supplies. If they returned, he would be prepared. Hours went by, and the sound outside seemed to press in upon them. The dog kept a close distance, never departing from his side. Then, just before dawn, the security monitor buzzed to life again. This time, there was no hesitation from the vet. Sweat pouring down his back, he took hold of his flashlight and made his way to the door. He threw the door open into the cold outside air, which stung his skin. The street was deserted, though he could sense eyes on him from some darkened corner. "I'm not scared of you," he said aloud, his voice firm despite the dread roiling in his gut. "And I'm not letting her go." The words filled with air, a challenge to whoever was there. So for a moment, there was silence. Then from where we could not see, a car engine coughed to life and choked into the night. The vet lingered at the sidewalk with his breath steaming into the cold air. Eventually, he spun around and headed back in, slamming the door behind him. He knew they would be back, but next time he would be prepared for them. The dog nudged his hand, her eyes alive with quiet strength. "We're in this together," he whispered, and his voice was fierce. "No one's taking you away." And deep down, the vet realized that they had just crossed a line. There was no going back now. The fight was only beginning. The sun crept up slowly, casting soft light on the street, but it didn't do much to change the tension in the clinic. The vet sat behind a desk, his eyes weighty with fatigue. He hadn't slept at all. Instead, he spent the night watching the security footage, waiting for another sign of the mysterious figure who had loomed outside. The dog lay where she always did, her eyes shut. She appeared unaffected by what had happened the previous night, her faith in the vet as solid as ever. "You're the brave one," the vet said gently, looking up at her. "I just have to catch up." He got up and stretched, hoping to throw off the fatigue. Just as he was about to make a cup of coffee, the clinic phone rang, its shrill tone punctuating the silence. The vet frowned. It was early, too early even for many clients to be calling. "Hello?" he said, his voice tentative. There was a pause on the other end, then a voice, a man's voice, steady but disconcerting. "You shouldn't have thrown the note," the caller added. The vet's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" he asked, the pounding of his heart. But the line went dead. The vet paused for a moment, the phone still to his ear. His mind raced. Whoever had been outside the clinic was now speaking directly to him. No longer was this threat passive, it was active, calculated. He put the phone down and took a breath. His eyes turned to the dog, who was watching him now, ears all perked up. "They're not going to make us afraid," he said more to himself than her. "We cannot turn back now. We are too far in to turn back now." Searching for answers, the vet contacted the police again. This time, they said they would send a detective to follow up. As he waited, he took matters into his own hands. He sat down at his computer and started putting together what he knew. The abandoned house, the raid on the illegal breeder, the note, the mysterious figure. It was all linked. But how? He Googled the address of the house, hoping to learn more. After a few seconds, an old news clip popped up. It involved a breeding ring that had been running out of several different properties in the area. The main perpetrator had disappeared without a trace following the raid, leaving behind a tangle of questions. There was a photo accompanying the article, a blurry image of a man in front of a shabby white building. The vet's heart went out of his chest. It was the same man who had come to the clinic days earlier, inquiring about the dog. "It's him," the vet whispered, tightening his fingers around the mouse. His mind raced. If the man remained in the area, it meant he hadn't quit. He had been watching, waiting for the opportune time to attack. A knock at the door pulled the vet from his thoughts. He walked over and opened the door to a detective standing on the porch, serious but calm. "I'm Detective Harris," the man said, extending his badge. "You called about a threat." The vet nodded and, in short order, relayed the whole story, beginning with the dog's rescue and ending with the phone call that morning. The detective listened intently, his eyes narrowing as the vet related what he had seen of the man about whom the mysterious stranger had been asking. "This isn't the first time we've heard of him," the detective said, speaking in a low voice. "We've been tracking him for months. He is connected to several criminal enterprises, but he always slips through the nets when we close in." The vet's heart sank. So, what do? We keep her safe, the detective said definitively. We will assign an officer to patrol the area. But if this man is what we think he is, he won't stop until he has what he wants. The vet looked at the dog, his jaw going hard with determination. Then, we don't want to give him a chance, he said. We'll be ready for him. The detective nodded, the look on his face grave. Stay alert, and if anything else happens, anything at all, call me at once. As the detective walked out, the vet locked the door behind him and turned back to the dog. I guess we have some work to do, he said gently, kneeling next to her. But fear not, we're not going anywhere. The dog waggled her tail slightly, her eyes shining with silent strength. The vet knew he was in for a fight, but he also knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. They had each other, and that was sufficient. For now. But the tempest was far from over. The air in the clinic was suffocatingly quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The vet paced back and forth, his thoughts racing. The detective's visit had given him a sense of temporary relief, but the weight of what was coming pressed down on him like a storm gathering on the horizon. He couldn't stop thinking about the man in the photo, the same man who had stood in the clinic pretending to be just another passerby. Why now? Why is he after her? The vet muttered, his eyes darting toward the dog. She was lying on her bed, her eyes half closed, her breathing calm and steady. But the vet knew better. He could feel it in his gut. They were running out of time. Just as he sat down at his desk to gather his thoughts, the security monitor flickered. His breath caught. The same car, the one with the tinted windows, was back. This time, it wasn't parked across the street. It was right in front of the clinic. They're getting bolder, the vet whispered, his pulse quickening. He watched as the car door opened, and the man from the photo stepped out, his movements deliberate and calm. He stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the clinic's front door. Then, without hesitation, he began walking toward it. The vet's heart raced. He grabbed his phone and dialed the detective's number. "Detective Harris, he's here," the vet said, his voice trembling with urgency. "Lock the doors and stay inside. I'm sending officers your way," the detective replied, his tone steady but serious. The vet hung up and locked the front door, his hands shaking. He turned to the dog, who was now sitting up, her eyes locked on him. "It's okay, girl," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "Help is on the way." A loud knock at the door made him jump. "Open up," the man's voice called from outside. It was calm, almost friendly, but there was something beneath the surface, something dark. The vet didn't move. "I know you have her," the man continued. "You think you're helping her, but you don't understand. She belongs to me." The vet's jaw clenched. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he muttered under his breath. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "We can do this the easy way," the man said, his voice still eerily calm. "Or the hard way." The vet backed away from the door, his heart pounding. He grabbed a metal flashlight from the counter, clutching it tightly. The dog let out a low growl, her eyes locked on the door. She stood protectively in front of the vet, her body tense and ready. "Good girl," the vet whispered. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air, their wail growing louder by the second. The man outside froze. For a moment, everything went still. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his car. The engine roared to life, and the car sped away just as two police cruisers pulled up in front of the clinic. The vet exhaled, his body trembling with adrenaline. Detective Harris was the first to enter, his eyes scanning the room. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. The vet nodded slowly. He was here. He tried to get in. The detective's jaw tightened. "We'll find him," he promised. "But until then, we'll have officers stationed here around the clock. You're not alone in this." The vet glanced at the dog, who was now sitting calmly beside him, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "I've got her," the vet said, his voice firm, "and I'm not letting her go." The detective gave him a nod of respect. "We'll keep her safe together." As the officers secured the perimeter, the vet sank into a chair, his body finally relaxing. He ran a hand through his hair, his heart still racing. The dog rested her head on his lap, her eyes closing in contentment. "We're not going anywhere," the vet whispered, stroking her gently. "No matter what it takes, we're in this together." But even as he spoke those words, he knew the fight wasn't over. This man wasn't going to give up that easily. And the next time he came back, he wouldn't be knocking. The clinic was eerily quiet that night. The vet sat at his desk, staring at the security monitor, every muscle in his body taut. His gaze darted between the various camera feeds, searching for any sign of movement beyond the perimeter. The dog lay sprawled at his feet, her head draped over her paws, her eyes half closed but watchful. She could feel the tension in the air. For the past few days, things had been pandemonium, a back-to-back string of threats, bizarre visitors, and unmitigated fear. "We're almost done with this," the vet whispered, looking down at her. Just a little longer. Then it happened. The monitor flickered, and a shadow moved past the front door. The vet froze. As the figure came into focus, his heart leapt into his throat. That was the man. The same man who had been stalking their every move. He stood outside the door, looking in at the clinic through the glass. The vet caught his breath in his throat. Not again. The man pulled the door handle, jiggling it once, and then again before stepping back. He appeared collected, perhaps too collected, as if he knew he wouldn't be rejected for long. "Open the door," the man said, his voice calm but icy. "We need to have a moment." The vet didn't move. He could hear his heart thumping in his ears. His fingers hovered over his phone, prepared to summon Detective Harris again. "I know you can hear me," the man went on, his eyes narrowing. "She doesn't belong to you. She belongs to me." The dog growled low, standing tall in front of the vet. Her body felt tight, every muscle wound up like a spring waiting to be released. The vet ground his teeth, his jaws clenching. "No," he muttered. "She doesn't belong to anybody." The very next moment was a chorus of sirens piercing the tension like a knife. The man turned his head toward the street. On his face, for one brief moment, his calm veneer cracked. He faced the vet again, his eyes ablaze with unsaid promise. "This is not over," he said, his voice low and menacing. And then he melted into the darkness, disappearing as the first patrol car arrived. The vet let his breath hang out, his body unclenching from its adrenaline high. He opened the door, and Detective Harris rushed in, looking around the room. "Are you okay?" the detective inquired, with urgency in his voice but a calm demeanor. The vet nodded, although his hands kept shaking. He was here. He tried to get in again. Harris's expression darkened. "We're closing in on him. He won't get far. We will have officers on patrol 24/7. You're safe here." The vet looked at the dog, who was now sitting calmly beside him with her eyes glued to him. She had no fear, only trust. "We're not going anywhere," the vet said, his voice strong, And we're not giving up." The detective nodded. "Good. We'll finish this. Together." When the officers had secured the area, the vet finally sat, the events of the last few days weighing down on him. His thoughts swirled as he ran a hand through his hair. The dog settled her head in his lap, eyes shutting in bliss. "We have a long way to go," the vet said quietly, petting her lightly, "but we'll make it. Together." And for the first time in days, the vet felt a slight spark of hope. A candlelight in the darkness that had devoured them for so long. But when he dug deep, he had one deep suspicion. Their story still didn't end. And when it came, he would be prepared. Morning sunlight bathed the clinic in soft light. The shadows of the previous night had been chased away. It was the first real, calm morning the vet had had in days. He took a seat in his chair and drank a sorely needed cup of coffee, his eyes drifting to the dog, sprawled in comfort on her bed. She was serene, the rise and fall of her breathing slow and gentle. It was over. The man was on the run, he was told. Police officers were stationed up the road to protect them. The vet could finally breathe easy for the first time in what felt like forever. "We did it," he said quietly, smiling down at the dog. "We made it through." The dog's eyes opened slowly. She wagged her tail, got up and patted over. She leaned into him, resting her head on his knee, her eyes on him with play on her lips and a strength that had gotten them through their darkest moments. "You're a tough little girl, you know that," the veterinarian said, patting her on the head. "I'm glad you happened here." But it wasn't just luck. It was something more, something that felt like destiny. This dog hadn't wandered into the clinic by accident. She had arrived at precisely the moment he needed her most, and together they had rewritten their narratives. The door chimed when Detective Harris entered, his expression a little more relaxed than it had been in days. "How's our hero doing?" the detective said, gesturing toward the dog. "Better than ever," the vet said, smiling. "Thanks to you." Harris chuckled. "It wasn't just me. She's the real fighter here." The vet nodded as pride swelled in his heart. "Yeah, she is. She's not only a fighter, she's a survivor." The detective shook his hand firmly. "We will update you regarding the investigation. But for now, relish this peace. You've earned it." The vet stood at the door a moment when the detective departed, looking out at the street soaked in a warm sunlight. The fear and panic that had so long loomed over the clinic were gone, replaced by something far more luminous. Hope. That afternoon, the vet picked up his camera and sat beside the dog. "Hi there, everybody," he said, his voice steady but full of feeling. "I wasn't going to share this story, but it seems like something worth sharing. Oftentimes, life finds you in places you never thought you would be. You think you're saving someone else, but it's actually them who saves you." He looked at the dog, who gazed up at him with her trusting eyes. "This amazing dog entered my life when I needed her most. She has fought through things that most of us cannot fathom, and yet through it all she kept going. And now she's here, safe and strong and loved." He paused, allowing that to sink in. "If one thing I've learned, every life matters. Everyone deserves a second chance at life. So, if you're ever in a position to assist, do so. Step up. Be the hero somebody needs." The screen holds on the dog briefly, her eyes glittering in the low light. "Until next time," the vet says, smiling warmly, "be kind, be compassionate, and remember that second chances exist." The screen goes black and the video ends, but a little spark still remains, warming your heart and energizing your soul. A little wink whose glimmer says, even in the deepest darkness, like an adventure in a lost and forgotten book, after some time, things can begin to happen.